Uh, Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Montesquieu Forum. Our lecturer today is Dr. Eric Schliesser from the University of Amsterdam, where, despite the fact that his PhD is in philosophy, he is a professor of political science. There are those who say that studying things outside of philosophy pay more money. But it just goes to show that if you're very nervy and clever, you can go to graduate school in philosophy and still survive. I went to dinner last night with Professor Schliesser along with Professor Minkoff, and I arrived back home, and my wife asked how it was, and I just looked at her. I was tired. And then she said, well, what about him? What's he like? And I said, he has a voluminous appetite. And my wife gave me that beleaguered, world-weary look that 40 years of marriage can produce. And then I explained to her that I wasn't talking about the food, that I was talking about his intellectual appetite. He's clearly one of the most learned human beings I've ever met. As evidence of this, in the last 4 years, he has produced 25 publications. His principal writing is on Adam Smith and Isaac Newton, and he works mostly the end of the 17th century into the beginning of the 19th century. But his learning doesn't stop there. There are people one encounters who know something, and you're a little bit surprised that they do. And then you continue talking to them, and they don't know the next thing. But with Dr. Schliesser, he knew the first thing, and then we get on to something else. He knew the second thing, and he knew the third thing, and the fourth thing, and he knew the relations among them. It was almost as if we were on a quiz show, but it didn't turn into that. Professor Schliesser is visiting from the University of Amsterdam. He's at Tulane University this year. We're very fortunate that he's in the country, which makes it easy to have him here. He actually knows a great deal about Chicago. His baccalaureate was from Tufts University in Massachusetts, but his PhD in philosophy was at the University of Chicago. Sort of view this as a welcoming home for him. Today he's going to be speaking about Voltaire's Candide, particularly the art of politics in Voltaire's Candide. Please join me in welcoming him to the Montesquieu Forum.
I'm not often speechless, but I'm not sure I have a good joke to contextualize this introduction. So thank you for that generosity and for the build-up. And now I have to, show what I can do. I don't teach Candide regularly. So for me, it was, well, at least I could multitask. For me, it was a reacquaintance with it. And I was immediately reminded why I don't teach it regularly, because it's an intensely on-the-nose book that just keeps rushing by one awful thing after another. And it reminded me a bit of watching the news online. And sometimes I read books to get away from all of that, not to be confronted by it. But the other reason why I don't teach it regularly is that it's actually, despite the beautiful French and familiarity of the topics, it's actually not an easy book to analyze and to discuss and to put in words. And so one of the reasons why I'm actually grateful, very selfish reason, is that thinking about this lecture really made me have to confront, what do I think of this book? Is there a take-home message? Does it still matter? Is this part of the Enlightenment we should leave behind? Or is there something here that's worth preserving? I'm not going to answer all these questions, but I am going to try to get control of the material. But I do want to really emphasize, for me, this is a book about restlessness and movement. We really don't get a chance, deliberately don't get a chance to contemplate the scene we've just read together and encountered, because we're immediately moving on to the next generally awful episode. Even the ones that are, or especially the ones that are funny, are usually incredibly awful too. So when I first started thinking about the lecture, I thought, well, what this book is really doing, it's inventing the 24/7, 365 news cycle and the feeling you get with that. The combination of rage and boredom. I think words that are both used in a text. And we for sure, and rage as well, come to think of it. So, and then when you start thinking about Candide, you realize this is not a person prone to contemplation and self-reflection. So you don't get, as it were, commentary on what you're experiencing from Candide. So it leaves you, qua reader, very helpless. In fact, I think he only starts thinking on the very last page. I will actually make that claim later in the talk. He's introduced as having a simple soul, a very simple soul. L'esprit de plus simple. You'll correct my French, I hope. And all we learn from him throughout, well, that's too strong, but what we learn from him throughout the text is that he desires this woman he's met, I don't know, a couple of minutes, really. It's not a very long relationship. And he keeps desiring her until he has to fake it. Right? So what he's desiring is more an image than anything. He doesn't get to know her. And then when he has the chance, he really doesn't want to. So there's a sense, leaving aside his impulsive killing and other stuff, this is not somebody we want to admire, even though he's also a victim. And I think it matters to why I found it so difficult to teach him over the years is he doesn't have an inner life that I think is easy to relate to at all. At the start of the book, and then I'll set up my lecture for real. At the start of the book, he's cast out of Eden explicitly, like Adam and Eve. And he's set to walk the earth sort of aimlessly. And in the French, Candide chassait de paradis terrestre, marchant longtemps sans savoir. Without knowing, without knowledge. He's an ignoramus in some sense. And in the final paragraph, we finally see Candide reflect, and reflect deeply, de profonde réflexion. So you would like to think there's this movement from a simple soul who doesn't know to thinking at the end. But this is not done in a way that's really convincing at first. Right? So you'd like to think this is a story of growth and then turning, and the soul discovers knowledge, and then we have wisdom. But actually it's 99% no knowledge and maybe potentially 1% at the end wisdom. And that's not convincing. So that's a hard It's a hard story to get your head around. So I think part of the project is to try to characterize what the insight actually consists in, if it is insight. And then second of all, to figure out to what degree Voltaire wants us to endorse it, if that's possible in a text that's so layered. And also to maybe get at what's at stake here politically. And so that was my introduction. What is the message? Is the message endorsed? And why should we care politically about it? Good three parts. So for me, why this matters is because I'm not a Voltaire fanboy. I'm not a I don't. In fact, Voltaire's lover, Émilie de Châtelet, she is a scholarly interest of mine. She's one of the great Newtonians of the 18th century, fantastic writer, important metaphysician. And Voltaire is kind of, from my point of view, the lightweight alongside her. But when he was about 50 years old, 54, he wrote letters, English letters. He published in English first, so I don't have to embarrass my French teacher with my accent. Lettres philosophiques was the translation. And this was an important book in the European intellectual culture of what became the Enlightenment. Voltaire was exiled, sort of self-exiled to England. He'd been the enfant terrible of French letters, went off having affairs with women he shouldn't have affairs with, write plays and make fun of people that he shouldn't make fun of. Ended up in Holland, a good place to end up in, I tend to say, where he actually enjoyed, somewhat surprisingly, the climate and also intellectual climate. But years in England were clearly formative because there he discovered English letters, English science, and English politics. And he thought all of that was a clear improvement over French despotism and French Catholicism and French social hierarchy. Of course, all of that needs to be said with nuance, but that was the main message of the English letters. And importantly for people like me, because it has important discussions about Isaac Newton in there and the role of Newtonianism in science. But the letters start with a kind of encomium to Quakers and Quakerism. The first 4 out of 24 letters are about Quakers. And since I'm talking to an American audience, I think letter 4 is especially important because William Penn is held up as one of the greatest legislators of all time. And I should say in Europe, Penn is not so well remembered, which is a shame because he developed a peace plan for European peace with the European Court of Justice and the European Council. So in many ways, he is one of the inventors of the European Union. Benjamin Franklin took that plan for federalism and developed the Albany Plan. So in American political history, that part of Penn is rather important. But Voltaire loves Penn because on his somewhat idealistic, but by the 18th standards, incredibly hopeful narrative, Penn founds Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, as you all know, there's, relative to all other states in the world, enormous religious toleration, a reasonably good attitude toward natives. There are treaties that get made and that get honored, and also reasonably secure property rights and commercial activities. And you don't have to declare much about your identity in order to participate in Pennsylvania flourishing. From the point of view of an 18th century European, Pennsylvania is utopia. And Voltaire repeats that story in all kinds of other writings. And so when I reacquainted myself with Candide and also started studying the map of visits, I was incredibly disappointed that Candide, in all of his travels, doesn't find his way to the East Coast. And then my story would have been easy. Now, we might suspect that he didn't do so because at the time of the writing and also at the time of the historical action of Candide, England and France are at war. And it would have been somewhat provocative to hold up the enemy, a colony of it, as the superb place to be in the middle of this war. But I do think that asks from us a little bit more reflection on the implied context of Candide and also how we're invited to think about war and etc. So that's what I want to do next. I want to spend a bit of time thinking about the context of Candide. And then I want to spend quite a bit of time analyzing the episode in El Dorado, which looks like it's the best place to be in the book. And then, hopefully with time, I will end up with a start of an analysis of the garden at the end. Right, so that's the plan, assuming most of you have read the book, so I don't have to do every detail. So I have this beautiful lecture, and then I have these notes, and I realize I cannot read my own handwriting. In fact, the only way I could probably read my own handwriting is do this. Interesting. I usually lecture with PowerPoints, and so this is a problem I don't usually encounter in my own handwriting. So, yeah, this will work. So the Candide is inserted in real historical time, right? Like the Avengers, like Forrest Gump. Thank you for laughing. That was the one joke I prepared. And like Forrest Gump and like Zelig for the older ones here. Perhaps like Gulliver's Travels. I mean, he's not the first to do this, Voltaire. But Candide is very much part of historical action. Most famously, of course, the Lisbon earthquake. That's a real event that really shook people. But also the assassination, or I should say the execution of Admiral Byng is also a real event. I spent some morbid time looking up all the details of that last week. I'll spare you that. But Voltaire knew Byng and spoke out against this. And of course, if you remember chapter 23, where the Dutch scholar Martin, who is probably the most boring character in the book, reminds Candide that there is a war going on for bits of snow up in Canada, right? And that's the 7 Years' War. So this is both the time of writing and the implied period. This is an age of war, in fact, a very seminal war, although it's interesting to what degree one can know in real time if a war is seminal or not. And like my quasi-Voltairean hero Pen, the narrative of Candide is anti-war. War is a bad thing, shouldn't be glorified. It's important to realize that that's not a trivial claim. In our Socratic culture, war is the highest good. Killing other people is a sign of status, and it's status enhancing. It gets you property, gets you honor, gets you offspring, gets you property. It's the thing to do, and Europe has been doing it very well at this time for a long time. So articulating an anti-war message is, in some sense, Christian, and in another sense, wholly original. And this is on par, I think, with, I'm sure you discussed this, I hope you discussed this, the anti-slavery message of the book. Right, at least the cruelty of slavery, the Suriname, again, a Dutch colony, I might add. All the bad things in the book are really connected to the Dutch, which is a kind of interesting rhetorical choice. And what's especially notable, I think, about the anti-slavery stance of the book is that we know that Voltaire himself profited from the slave trade, was by 18th century standards a racist, right? So the book itself tells us something about the complications of Voltaire, the author, Voltaire's life, and his political views, which are not always coherent and not always the same thing. There's a moment in the El Dorado episode where Candide is marveling at the public fountains. And then one of these fountains sprouts cane sugar liquor. In the 18th century, that's slave product. Right? But in El Dorado, there don't seem to be slaves. Right? So at that moment, you want to really know, is this the product of mechanical ingenuity? Or is there a hidden slave economy even in El Dorado? Right? So El Dorado itself raises interesting questions. And in the book, I think we really are invited to think about three aspects of El Dorado. The mores, customs, you might say, the practices, the institutions, and then again, something I can't read, but I'll assume it's politics. I have to learn to hire a scribe before I do a lecture, geez. Okay, so El Dorado is practically hermetically sealed off from the rest of the world. Has immensely high mountains, dangerous rivers, and is otherwise tough to get in and out of. So by nature, we might want to say, it's almost an island inside a continent. And this is reinforced by convention that apparently has authoritative tradition behind it, that the original El Doradoans, word original there is a weasel word, I'll get back to that in a second, that they vote for self-limiting themselves not to leave the country. No El Doradoan has the right to exit, we would say. And somewhat surprisingly to us in a universe where immigration and borders are central political questions, in the world of Candide, being able to cross borders if you had some money was entirely normal. Surprisingly mobile populations, in fact, from our point of view, making sure that people stay in and out really becomes a big deal in the 19th century. Now, Voltaire is not inventing this institution out of whole cloth, because famously the Chinese had closed themselves off from the world in 1530, give or take. No foreign expeditions would be sponsored anymore. All the ships got famously burned or left to rot. And Chinese tradespeople had controlled trade in the Indian Ocean and around the Pacific for millennia were pulled back. Right? So the reader of Candide will almost certainly be thinking of the Chinese and perhaps of the Japanese, who had decided to let import and export only go through one harbor, and that harbor would be controlled by the Dutch. Right? So self-limiting one's exposure to the outside world, that's not a big innovation. but an incredibly rare one. Now, if you're told this is a state that limits exposure to the outside world, that doesn't want to trade with the outside world, doesn't want to see people come in and out of the outside world, you kind of expect a tyranny. I hope I don't offend any North Koreans, but you kind of expect something like North Korea, where it's sort of a dangerous border and you don't want to go in and out without good diplomatic passport. But it turns out El Dorado seems not like a tyranny at all. In fact, one of the really striking immediate events is when Candide shows up. He and his companion, they receive really wonderful hospitality. Right? In my lecture, I call it cosmopolitan hospitality. We learn that hospitality is subsidized by the state. We learn that, in fact, all the roads in El Dorado have inns and have public inns where travelers and potentially traders can eat. In fact, we learn about El Dorado that a lot of the infrastructure is public. It's publicly financed and publicly organized. We quickly realize that there are no, well, let me put it differently. I don't know if this is a quick realization, but we are told with pride that there are no lawyers. And that tells you there's no property. Because if there is property, you're going to have fights over who gets what. Right? So no lawyers sort of entails no property, at least no individual property. We already kind of get a clue of that immediately when we encounter El Dorado, because the gold is treated like worthless. Right? This also, for Candide's readers or Voltaire readers, would have evoked More's Utopia, where the same practice exists. But the big difference between Utopia and El Dorado is that the Utopians, they're aggressive imperialist warmongering people. El Dorado is a really pacific state. And it's also but there are other similarities, I think. El Dorado tries to be relatively egalitarian. We see this in two ways, I think. First is when you approach the king, there's a ritual you have to perform. And like a good European, Voltaire expects a curtsy or a bow or a taking off the hat or some kind of submission. But what he ends up being told he has to do, and I'm going to quote, he has to hug the king and kiss him on both cheeks. Now, this is the most Amsterdam thing to do, I should say. And I'm curious when the Dutch started doing this with each other and if it was some kind of Voltaire enthusiast who got this started. But what I do know, and in fact, as a kid, I was told this, this way of greeting another is a sign of mutual respect and equality. And it reminded me also of the passage in the letters, the English letters, where the Quakers are praised by Voltaire for their anti-hierarchical sensibility and their practices that all reject aristocratic hierarchy. The Quakers were famously thought rude and uncivil and couth and uncultured because they refused to doff their hats and don their hats. They refused to curtsy, and they would say you rather than thou. Right? They were uncivil. But in their incivility, they were egalitarians, cultural egalitarians, good Christians. We're hinted at that there is some sexual equality in El Dorado, because the king's guard is a female guard. But this theme is actually underexplored. And if you're a reader of the utopian literatures, not just More, but Bacon and others, Plato, of course, you would have wanted a little bit more on this. But El Dorado is annoyingly quiet. Crucially, of course, El Dorado is super rich. The wealth is clearly founded on science and technology, which is one of the main activities there. I, this morning, so rather late in preparing this lecture, decided that they'd found the cure for near eternal life in El Dorado, because actually a lot of the people that Candide encounters there are incredibly old. In fact, one of the people they meet is, I think, in 170, and his dad served what looks like the very same king that still exists. So the people are really, really old in El Dorado, and presumably their medicine is really very advanced. Now, how am I doing on time?
No. You're doing fine.
Excellent. Well, you don't know how long I still have. But yes, I think we're like 10 more minutes? Okay, good. So, Candide, who's been traveling all over Europe and South America, is of course very impressed by the Eldoradians. And then he comments, and let me quote, "This is a vastly different from Westphalia, that's Germany, and the Baron's Castle. Had our friend Dr. Pangloss seen El Dorado, he would no longer have said that the castle Thunder den Trunk was the finest upon earth. It is evident that we must travel." Right? And at first, when I read this, I thought, oh, this is clever. It's a kind of empirical refutation of the rationalism of Pangloss. But it's a little more funny than that, because the Eldoradians haven't traveled at all to get where they are, and in fact, they refuse to travel. So Pangloss is praising a state based on empirical observations of a world, but that state itself denies itself this empirical access, right? So one way to put this, what we see is not what we really should be thinking about. And I think if we think about the politics of El Dorado, we start seeing a further complication. So to remind you, the political structure of El Dorado originates in the moment when the Incas and the local El Doradoans split off. Very striking passage. The Incas, of course, were the conquerors of South America until the Spanish showed up. And they traced their own contemporary political order to some royal members of the royal household who kind of said, no, we're not moving, we're staying. And in that moment, they invent a form of democracy. So you have this Inca society, which is a really very hierarchical, aristocratic, militaristic, and technologically sophisticated culture that leaves. And the ones that stay behind say, well, whatever we do, we're not going to be like them. We're going to be peaceful, we're going to close ourselves off, and we're going to be somewhat democratic. Right? So there's I don't want to say we have hints of a civil war or we have hints of a political conflict, but we definitely have hints of a choice to go in the opposite direction, namely to stay, not to be aggressive, and to be democratic. But there is a reason to be suspicious about this narrative. Over and above the fact that I'm in political theory now, we were polite not to mention that, but we tend to not take political narratives at face value. We actually have evidence that the story that's being told has to be more complicated. And this evidence is the fact that the father of Candide's first informant in El Dorado had been part of the royal household of the current king and had witnessed the defeat of the Incas by the Spaniards. So that happened around 1530. So we literally are talking about 220 years before the implied narrative time. This is why I think people in El Dorado are getting very old, if a son of a father, etc. But that person had left El Dorado and had come back. And we're told by the people in El Dorado that actually the not going out and in part, that's from the founding. So there's a 100-year discrepancy implied by the details of the story. That usually tells you that when a narrative about a founding can't get its facts straight, that there's more conflict than you realize. So El Dorado has had more grumblings than we know. And what's also interesting just about the dates, the Spaniards defeat the Incas around 1530, and that's also pretty much the moment where China closes itself off from the world. So that, from the point of view of the implied narrative inside Candide, it seems like to be a very important moment in world history. Now, the reason I bring up the Chinese here twice now is that when Voltaire discusses the Chinese in an essay on universal history, which he published a few years before Candide, but we know he wrote it at the same time, he starts off that book with a rather elaborate discussion of Chinese politics. A super respectful, super admiring discussion. In fact, Voltaire was part of a larger debate that Rousseau, Hume, and Adam Smith had, is how to actually import Chinese management practices, bureaucratic practices, into Europe. Because the general view was the Chinese were doing statecraft much better than the Europeans. And what Voltaire praises, in addition to their political economy, is the fact that they have a state religion, Confucianism, that is monotheistic, but without the superstition and priest class and all the things that Voltaire thinks make Catholicism bad. However, in China, on Voltaire's reading, Confucianism is an elite religion because there's a separate religion for the masses, Buddhism. But if you now look at the way that religion is treated in El Dorado, it echoes this account of Confucianism in the history. Right? So part of the problem of interpretation is that El Dorado has a lot of things that Voltaire praises elsewhere, but at the same time is too good to be true. Things are going on there that we know he's also questioning. Right, so the El Doradans are anti-imperialist, they're Pacific in character. They lack priests, they lack lawyers. These are all good things, sorry. And they are fairly moderate in their practices, except that they seem to have this desire for a nearly immortal life. Right, that's the one exception to it. And then when they're told by Candide that Candide wants to leave, the king says, where one is reasonably happy, one ought to stay. Why move if things are going well? I certainly have no right to detain you. That's a slight mistranslation, but we'll live with it. That's a form of tyranny, found neither in our country nor in our laws, and all men are free. Right? So if you're not free to leave, the question from the political point of view is, how free are you? Right? That's I'm not going to answer that today. But the reason why Candide leaves, which is explained in part by Cacambo, we love so much to be on the go, to show off among our own, to make a display of what we've seen on our travels. Right? We want to leave because we want to tell a story. And we want to leave because we are vain enough to think that others will be interested in our story. Right? We're not leaving because we're expecting something good. Intrinsically, we're expecting applause. Right? So the story here becomes a form of self-display. And in fact, if you trace in Candide the words spectacle and parade, spectacle and parade, it shows up in various places, and it's generally speaking, it has an edge to it, right? So the desire to be seen by others and a willingness to risk being part of all kinds of displays, that's really the insidious part of European modernity that Voltaire is putting his finger on. Problem is, this very desire to be seen, to have applause, to have one's story recognized, that's the engine of economic progress and arguably the engine of scientific discovery. Right? So the very thing that makes us insufferable to each other and to ourselves is also part of Europeans' imperial movement. Five minutes? 6 minutes? Okay, let me start wrapping up. I mean, this last theme is an Adam Smith theme, so that's a different story. So Candide starts deeply reflecting when he meets the old man near Constantinople. And this person is introduced as a worthy or good person, an aged good person, un bon vieillard. And this man also shows cosmopolitan hospitality. He invites the strangers into his house. Like the Anabaptists, Jacques at the start, and like the Eldoradoans. And he is, in fact, later called the good Muslim, the bien musulman. And he is the source of the one good message the book gives us. Right? This is we might initially call it an anti-political art of good living, where one works hard and where one keeps, it's a kind of negative morality, where it keeps the three great adversities at bay: boredom or ennui, vice, and necessity. And necessity here means hunger or famine. Trois grands mots. Now here it's worth mentioning, because I haven't seen it in the secondary literature, that Voltaire's great love, Emily de Châtelet, her last book was a book on happiness where she theorizes ennui or boredom, and she herself thinks that work is one of the antidotes against it. Right? So this is in part an homage to de Châtelet. Now, why does this all matter? So first of all, it matters that the words of wisdom come from a Muslim, because in the 18th century, not unlike ours, there was a great deal of suspicion toward Muslims in Europe. It's especially notable that this particular Muslim is not crazed for wealth and domination, because among the stereotypes that 18th century Muslims had was that they loved despotism and luxury. His way of life can be summarized by honest work and keeping one's head firmly to the ground and caring for family. Now, crucially, when Candide interprets this and reinterprets this, he himself and Martin evoke both More's Utopia and Genesis 2:15. And Genesis 2:15 is like the origin of the Protestant work ethic. You work hard, you till the land, and you steward the land. Right? It's also the source of a kind of Christian environmentalism, but it brings together stewardship and the work ethic. Crucially, from the point of view of the text, it's the one place where the generation of order seems to be self-contained and uncorruptible. Now, my last two thoughts on this are as follows. First of all, if you look at the way Candide organizes his troupe, it's like a modern co-op. Importantly, it's not like a commercial enterprise, but it's like a co-op where everybody does what they're fitted to do. So you have a division of labor and you've got specialization, but you have a common good. So that's the one important thing. The second part of that is that what looks like to be here the art of living really just is a kind of reinvention of what the ancients and also many of the moderns would have called estate management, oikomania, where the modern word of economy comes from. Problem from the point of view of political theory, and this is also my last thought on it, is that that doesn't scale up. So we're left with a problem in this text from my point of view, which I hope we can investigate together in Q&A, is what the book explains to be the good life, a form of cooperative estate management, is manifestly not sufficient for the needs of a modern state. And here's the big irony. It's Voltaire's great rival, Rousseau, who just a few years before had made that argument. Discourse on Political Economy. So we know that that can be Voltaire's real own long-held message. But at this point, I have to throw up my hands and close the lecture.
If you'd be kind enough to lower your hands and have others raise their hands and call on them, we would appreciate it.
Great. Are there drinks after? You. Dude.
By the end of the book,
What's your name?
Byron.
Byron.
By the end of the book, there seem to be two characters who don't change and who cling on to their old ways, their old names. The Cunegonde's sister, the new Baron, who clings on to this idea that Candide can't marry her because he's not noble, and Pangloss, who in the very last and is like, oh, well, I'm right, aren't I? And what are we to make of that? That these are the two people who don't change, and that one of them ends up in a ship's galley in Rome.
Yes, so that's a non-trivial part. He gets shipped off unceremoniously. It's the sort of final act of cruelty of the book. I mean, you might say he gets his comeuppance, but it's also, just come up. If death weren't enough, this was indeed what he needed. So what do we make of the unchangingness? I agree with you that he doesn't change. This is a good question because he really stands in for the aristocratic ethos that refuses to accommodate itself to either new money or new ideas. Right? So in many ways, the fact that he refuses to accommodate itself to new money is a sign that the time is up, because we see in Britain that that's already evolving. Um, and I do think it's one of the most revolutionary passages in Voltaire, because I think the message there is aristocracy will be deposed. Pangloss, I think, is um, I don't think this is particularly. I don't think this follows from what I've said so far. So this is ad hoc and perhaps also superficial. But I think Pangloss really illustrates that a certain kind of philosophy is, to use a modern phrase, is unfalsifiable. It's immune to empirical change, because it can tell the story in such a way that new circumstances will fit the old philosophy. And I think that is a critique that Voltaire articulates against the kind of rationalism that Pangloss is supposed to represent. So that's mine. But do you have another interpretation?
No, I think I can agree with what you said.
Well, that's nice. But if you change your mind and it stays as quiet, we will continue. Byron, right? Yes.
Yeah.
What's your name?
Camille.
Camille.
What's, I guess, your interpretation of the fact that a lot of people, some people and I, but a lot of people who you think are in it are turned out not to be in it, and they're just fine. Like, all these terrible things keep happening. Like, Cunegonde gets stabbed, and then the old woman, like, all these things happen to her. Pangloss is hanged, and the Baron gets stabbed. Like, it kind of lowers the stakes of, like, oh, like, something like that happens to someone, you're like, well, I mean, it's really that bad because they're probably going to come back. What do you think of that?
Yes. So I think this is so I love your question, and I also should say that the fact that that happens makes the story lose its power to unsettle, I think, along the way, right? Because I really think, depending on how we keep count, but Candide himself is a mass killer. Right? But if it turns out that not all the killing counts, then yeah, I mean, how should we even evaluate him? So I agree that I think helps explain why this book appears in series that are called classics. But if you actually look to reflection on it, people don't really like taking up Candide as a book to seriously constantly think through and off. I actually edited some volumes called Neglected Classics, and it would be perfect for that, because everybody knows it, everybody's read it, but it's actually very hard to take seriously if you don't force yourself to think about it, because of problems like this. I do think we're partly being, maybe you have thought of this too, we're partly being asked to think about resurrections of different kinds. Right? So I think there is a potential mockery here of how easy is it to turn out to be alive? How easy is it to have graves that turn out to be empty because the person you thought was dead wasn't dead? So I think that might be lurking in the background. And I don't think that's totally silly, given the anti-organized church hierarchy part of religion that's running through this story. But it happens so often that that's the best I can do. I also think, and this is sort of one of the subtexts of my own lecture, so I might as well reiterate it. I think that desensitization to awful things is an important theme of both how we read it and how we experience this book. And I think that's intentional. And I think what makes the desensitization so difficult and tricky is precisely because we have awful things, one after another. Some of these awful things turn out to be actually not so awful. And then we also run the risk to be thinking about those cases more than the awful cases, which is another mechanism of kind of displacing from the horror. So I think these issues actually, if I were media studies, I'd probably have more interesting things to say about it. But I think this is why I think Voltaire is really theorizing for us what it's like, or engaging, enacting for us something we think we're the first to experience and hyper sophisticated about, namely this constant barrage of awful news, but simultaneously this constant barrage of news that turns out not to be really what it says it was. So maybe that is important. Okay. Yes, what's your name? Iman?
Yes. I have a question about El Dorado
Mm-hmm.
because in the book it's like supposed to be perfect. There's no crime, there's no poverty, you don't need a lawyer, there's no priest, like gold, everybody rich, but nobody is rich at the same time. Everybody is equal, but everybody lives good. Yet Candide and Cacumbo,
I like your pronunciation better than mine.
they decide to leave to sort of show off their wealth and tell their story somewhere else. So my question was, is Voltaire sort of trying to tell us that people would rather live like above others and be higher up in an unequal world than be at the same level as everybody else and have everyone live good in an equal world?
So I think that's a great question. I think this helps explain why this book was so popular during the Cold War, because that is one way to read that episode. Um, I do think Voltaire and actually quite a few people in the middle of the 18th century thought that the desire for distinction and the desire for recognition is potentially so powerful that an equalizing society is an unstable outcome, right? So I think that's the case. But El Dorado is supposed to be an existence proof, right? So you might then think, and then I'll let you interject, you might then think, well, what's really happened is that if you're raised in a corrupt society like Candide, then your own moral development is such that you can't actually live and live well in a good society, right? Because that's what El Dorado is supposed to be, right? So then you would think, oh, the answer to that is education and better moral cultivation, etc. And whatever else the moral of this book is, Candide has had terrible moral education. Right? In one of the versions of my lecture, I actually am very explicit that he doesn't have conscience. Right? He doesn't have inner voices telling him what to do and what not to do, and then reflect on. He doesn't feel guilt over a lot of the awful things he does. Right? So what's interesting about him is that he's in a way he's not a sinner who knows he's doing wrong. He's somebody who seems to lack serious cognitive and moral self-awareness, right? Now, if you don't notice that in the book, and B, you think that that's common, then that's sort of evidence that you've grown up in a depraved circumstances, morally depraved, right? So then you might say, well, actually, he's not worthy for a place like El Dorado. So I think the internal dynamic and dialectic, if we take El Dorado at face value, and I've given you some reason to suspect maybe it's not as great as it wants to say it is, then it is also an indictment against the kind of personality type that can't actually live in a good world and the society that generates him. I think this is true for nearly all the characters we encounter, except the ones, this is why I spent some time on the Quakers, except the ones that grow up in small religious communities. So if you think about the Anabaptist, Jacques, he's a good person in many, many ways. He's hospitable, he's generous without judging. He does put you to work, right? So he's not, he believes in the gospel, the work ethic as being good for you. But relative to the rest of the people we encounter, clearly a good man. So it looks to me like part of the moral psychology that's lurking here is certain kind of small societies can actually develop individuals into moral agents that have conscience and generosity and could practice Christian benevolence. Aristocrats generally not, and most Europeans generally not either. Right, so that has perhaps something to do with either the church or anonymity. We'd have to know a bit more, I think. Does that help? He looks so unpersuaded. So
maybe I don't know. Maybe it's the point that like maybe it's once humans are like exposed to ambition, then they want to chase it, and maybe that like seclusion, like secluded groups, the seclusion prevents like the infection of ambition.
yes, so actually, I think this is an important question in empirical psychology, right? What are the conditions under which we can generate good enough moral development? And I think part of the common ground in 18th century psychology is a certain kind of seclusion or a certain kind of holding at bay, censorship, right? These are the kind of things that might help prevent the wrong sort of ambition from developing. But I think in Candide's case, I don't think really, I mean, he has desires, but I wouldn't call his desires ambition. I think actually only at the very end does he discover ambition, namely when he wants to start managing the garden. So in his case, I don't think ambition is the main source of his psychological deformity. Yes. What's your name? Jude. Jude?
June.
Oh, June. Okay. Getting old. Yeah.
I guess sort of like tying in what you said, so much of the book being like you were saying with the earthquake, and it's like connecting to like real places that has to happen.
Hold on. Start over. I will answer behind the microphone, but I'm going to step up to you because I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I guess like sort of tying into what you were saying about like parts of the book being so connected to like real events and like places with the earthquake. How important like to the understanding of the El Dorado protection do you think it is that like he chose to represent this like utopic place with like an entirely fictional place that like even the real world was like a legendary thing that people looked for and never found?
Well, so the question is, why is the utopian place fictional when we generally encounter real places in the book? I think partly that makes it more plausible, because if you say, like me, Pennsylvania in 1750 is the utopia of the world, people will show up in Philadelphia and say, no, it isn't. All kinds of bad things are happening here. These local Quakers who pride themselves, they're making money off the slave trade too, you know? Like there's no sinning, there's no absence of sinning in the real world. So I think you need, and I think this is well recognized by Moore and by Bacon and Robinson Crusoe's a fiction character, Defoe. I think everybody recognizes that utopia, if you want to make it plausible, has to be somewhere nowhere. That's the word. Because you can visit it. And because that's the thing that I think is really incredibly striking about Candide. If you look at the maps where people go, it is entirely plausible where people are traveling in the 18th century, which is a global thing. So we have cars and airplanes, but most of us never leave the neighborhood we've grown up in. This is America even today. But for these characters, it's entirely plausible that if you want to find out what a place looks like, you go on a boat and you visit. So I don't think you can plausibly describe a utopia and maintain quasi-plausible deniability. But I do think El Dorado has historical salience because Europeans are still quasi-hoping that there is a place where a massive amount of gold is for the grabbing. Right? That's also the story of the United States. That's the story of California. Right? So finding a place where you can find gold on the surface, that is just a ruling ideology. Not just California, South Africa. This story gets repeated throughout the next 200 years. But I think he needs an account that allows him to evoke More's utopia, and behind that, Plato's Republic, in a way that feels sufficiently up to date. And so he has to do a little bit more, I think. But did you have are you writing on this topic? Is this a topic you're exploring?
I just when I was reading those sections, the way I like your wit, and this might be me like.
Yeah. I just did me for 40 minutes. So go for it.
Like this might be my modern lens, and like this might not have been what Voltaire was saying
Yeah.
about, but like the idea that he was using this like place that we now know is fictional, that like people at the time had looked for and never found, to like be the location of this like perfect place. But then it is to like subtly kind of suggest that that place isn't possible, and like the kind of society there just isn't possible. That's I guess like how I was interpreting it.
Yeah, so we might. I'm over 50, so I should say yes, you're right, because I shouldn't believe in utopia, right? But I actually think that what he's asking of the Eldoradoans is not totally impossible for the 18th century mind. The idea that if you develop medicine and therefore can create a kind of immortality, actually we have very, very wealthy contemporaries who also believe that, right? So that part of the ideology of El Dorado, since Descartes and Bacon, that's an incredibly widely shared aspiration. I'm perfectly happy to believe that Voltaire thinks it's silly, but it would not have felt entirely silly to everybody reading the text. The idea that if you just invest a lot of money and energy in science and technology, that could transform the world, I think is a ruling ideology of the age, and perhaps something as an academic I should endorse too. And then the third thing, namely that if you work hard and organize work appropriately, that will massively transform from poverty to wealth. That's about to happen. That's the start of the Industrial Revolution, which for all of its ills also does this transformation. Right? So I don't think that if we were to treat Candide as scientific science fiction, hard science fiction, as we would say, that we then automatically have to rule El Dorado out. The part that seems bizarre to us is that people are surrounded by gold and wouldn't take the gold seriously. Right? And that's the conventional psychology part, has nothing to do with science. And there were places familiar to Europeans where silver was a thing to do and gold wasn't a thing to do. So it's implausible, yes. But actually to say what individual thing makes it implausible, well, then it gets harder. Which gets us back to Imani's question. Okay, we'll go to the back row.
My name is Jade. Going back to the bullet about utopia, I have two more questions.
Oh.
Is there could there be a utopia without any influence? And if there was to be no influence, do they consider themselves a utopia?
Wait. What do you mean by influence?
how can you go your utopia out to atmosphere and influence of, there's
Ah,
other suffering
yeah,
outside. The
yes,
second part is the utopia sustainable given, the nature of utopia with no moral exercise or development with no suffering? Or
good.
artificial suffering, human suffering is there.
Good. So these are actually connected questions, if I understand correctly.
Yeah.
Um,
It can also go a little bit deeper if you want to go.
yeah. So on the second one, a standard issue in thinking about utopians is if you lengthen life, you get a population problem. This is very explicit in More's utopia. It's also explicit in the Republic. It's explicit in Herland. If you start increasing life, the worry is people keep having sex and they keep reproducing. Where are the people going to end up going? Right? And El Dorado is specifically has limited surface. So it basically is an island. So there is a question: are they limiting births? Do they commit a form of euthanasia? What are they doing for population? Because it looks like they should be much fuller than it is. If this was a utopian fiction or science fiction novel, that would be one of the first questions to ask about El Dorado. And that Candide is not interested in. He's so obsessed by his one woman that he's not interested in, apparently, in the woman he meets. He's not interested in coupling. He's not really interested in reproduction. There are all kinds of issues here where the standard traveler is very obsessed by, and he's really shows lack of interest in. So I'm not sure what to say about how sustaining it is mechanically, but you're interested in something more intellectual. And I myself believe that closing yourself off from other ideas and other influences is a recipe for stagnation. I think the Chinese in the 18th century are held up as an example of a good kind of stagnation, but still stagnation. And I think that El Dorado is meant to somehow defy that, because it looks far advanced. It looks like it's able to organize itself, create machines that bring Candide out of the country. And, they organize 3,000 engineers in 2 weeks. How much is it?
3,000.
Yeah, 3,000 engineers in a few weeks. So this is like an organization, a state, a country that still is capable of massive amount of energy relative to what one might expect if you think this place is totally stagnant. Did I answer both questions, or did I evade both of them?
A little bit of vaguely. I'm more interested in, if there's no suffering in utopia,
The suffering.
can there be world developments? How can one learn to be a good person if everything is good and nothing bad happens? Assuming bad does happen, is a catastrophic meltdown.
I love that you asked this question after reading a book where only bad things happen and nobody develops. I mean, I think part of the greatness of Candide, I use the words, I'm finally seeing it, is that it attacks that ideology. Suffering is really not good for moral development. Suffering just reinforces itself.
So what do you mean by suffering reinforces itself? Because let's say we have a child who's never experienced hunger, loneliness, or any form of suffering. Even human needs. They never feel hungry. They never feel cold, too hot, and how do they, even beyond that, how do they develop morally?
Okay, so this is why I think Imani's question was so. Did I get your name right? Yeah. So why it's so important. It turns out that implicitly, each of us have views on the relationship between moral development and moral behavior. Some of us end up believing that suffering ennobles and allows us to grow, or makes us interesting. Right? So that's one category of views. Other people believe, well, actually, and a lot of parents my age believe this, we need to protect our children from unnecessary pain and challenges. So I remember as a kid in Amsterdam, I would play outside. My bourgeois friends in Amsterdam prevent their kids from playing outside, not because there's crime. Amsterdam doesn't have crime. No, but because they might hurt themselves. Right, so their view is that the only way you can develop into a proper is that you actually don't have pain at the wrong time. Maybe postpone pain as much as possible. I personally think there are many more views, but those are the two extremes. I think what part of what we see played out in Candide as a grotesque mirror of the 18th century is that you have these societies that are engaged in massive amount of cruelty towards subject nations, toward themselves, and toward the people they think are peers, and they don't come out morally better. Right? What the right answer to that is of course, this is why I think the question of Emmanuel is so important, how to think about what proper moral development is in the context of institutions, religion, economy, and how these interact, and if you push down on one of these, what happens on the other? I think that makes it such a hard and difficult question. There's no easy answers. But I think I am glad you asked the question, even though my answer was initially a bit tough. Yes.
I'm Marianne, and I wonder if you can say something about how you situate what Voltaire did in Fountain Voltaire between, on the one hand, El Dorado and on the other, the cultivated garden.
I think I missed a sentence. Can you ask the question again?
You know about Fountain Voltaire, maybe I'm pronouncing it that way, F-E-R-N-E-Y, the community that Voltaire creates outside of Geneva, where he...
I did not recognize what you're saying, but this was, yes.
So that's what I'm interested in. And, you know, because you said some fairly pessimistic things about scaling up and about utopia going nowhere. And found, you know, one Voltaire might argue that what he has done at Fountain Voltaire is a success. And one might then ask, well, you know, does it depend on there being a Geneva and there being a Paris or a Court of Versailles for Fountain to both separate itself from and interact with us?
Yeah, so it's an interesting and important question. Let me go back. Marianne?
Yes.
Interesting and important question, and one I had not thought about before the lecture, so I have to improvise a bit. But I think this question recurs throughout the 19th century, right? Because all kinds of, partially because of America, but not only because of America, all kinds of people set up units where they live together in groups that sustain themselves. 20th century, the Israeli kibbutz is another example. I myself have studied Owen and Owenite socialism. It's totally legitimate to say that one can create forms of self-organization that are sustainable over the medium term. So in that sense, and in fact, one of the favorite utopian novels of the 20th century, Ecotopia, tries to show that this is possible even at a larger scale. Problem is that I think, as you yourself indicate in the question, the people that have arms have to decide to leave you alone. And I think Voltaire himself recognizes that those conditions are going to be relatively special and limited. So I'm inclined to think that, yes, we want existence proofs in part, because I think of Imani's question, we want to be able to show that we can organize the family, the society, religion in such a way so that we can create people that are moral and flourishing. That, I think, is really needed to prove that. But the larger political question, I don't think gets solved by these existence proofs. And maybe that's not Voltaire's own view, but I do think Rousseau and others have good arguments there. So is that a fair enough answer, or do you feel like I missed the point?
I'll just hold my tongue because I think Rousseau's opinions on anything are not particularly a good response to.
Okay, then we don't do Rousseau. We do Adam Smith and also this. I mean, in fairness, none of, except for the kibbutzim, which themselves are rather distinctly militaristic enterprises, most of these things don't last that long. So when we start thinking about success and what counts as success, I'm perfectly happy to give the benefit of the doubt, because I think we learn from all these experiments in collaborative living. But the violent world that Voltaire also encounters doesn't go away in virtue of that. So that's why I think scale does matter.
Please join me in thanking Professor Schliesser.
No.
Thank you all for coming. Our next lecture in the Montesquieu Forum is Tuesday, April 28th, also at 4:30. Professor Chris Edelman will be talking about Montaigne's essay of vanity. And thank you for coming.